Hello, everyone. Welcome to this evening's John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Jana Ramadan. I'm a sophomore studying government and Near Eastern languages or modern Middle Eastern studies here at Harvard. And this year I serve as the co-chair of the Politics of Race and Ethnicity program at the Institute of Politics and as the political action chair of the Society of Arab Students. I'm a first-generation Palestinian American from Boston, Massachusetts, and I'm personally interested in pursuing a career at the cross-section of public service, human rights, discrimination, and law. So as you can guess, I'm very excited for today's forum. In today's forum, we're going to be discussing Arab American identity and achievements in public service. April marks Arab American Heritage Month, and to celebrate all month long, the Institute of Politics is hosting events focused and centering the Arab American identity and values and how they both influence community civic engagement. We're also spotlighting Arab members of our IOP community every week, and you can find that on our IOP Instagram. Today's conversation is going to center on the influence of Arab Americans in the political sphere, discussing obstacles in their public service journey, inspirations along the way, and future challenges to increasing Arab community civic engagement and representation. I'm honored to introduce two incredible Arab American women that I admire personally, former Congresswoman and Secretary of Health and Human Services, Donna Shalala, and Colorado State Representative Iman Jodeh. Both women have made history in their public service careers, Donna Shalala as the first Lebanese American to serve in a cabinet position, and Representative Iman Jodeh as the first Palestinian American to serve as a Colorado State representative and as Colorado's first Muslim lawmaker. They've both clearly paved new ways for engagement for aspiring Arab Americans in public service while advocating for their constituents as well. Donna Shalala served as a Secretary of Health and Human Services during President Bill Clinton's administration, going on to become the longest-serving Health and Human Services Secretary. In a short absence from public service, she served as the president of the University of Miami before returning to political work to lead the Clinton Foundation and run for office in Florida's 27th Congressional District. As Congresswoman, Shalala served on the COVID-19 Congressional Oversight Commission. Iman Jodeh hails from Colorado. As a first-generation American, her work leading up to running for office really related to serving her Arab and Muslim community. She founded Meet the Middle East to heal the relationship between Americans and Arab and Muslim communities, and her work saw her engaging with children's hospitals, the U.S. District Attorney's Office, and classrooms in an effort to heal her community. As community advocate and liaison for the Interfaith Alliance of Colorado and Colorado Muslim Society's first female spokesperson, Representative Jodeh worked to empower her community to advocate for itself on policy issues. She successfully ran for office in 2020 and now serves as the House Representative of Colorado's 41st District. Thank you both so much for joining us today, and I'm now going to pass it over to my peer student moderators, Anand, Hafez, and Lena Lofgren.
Beautiful. Good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. And thank you so much for joining us here in the forum. My father taught me by the eloquence of example to always say thank you before getting up to speak. This is obviously a huge privilege and a very special event. So I want to thank you all for joining us. As the chair of the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum, I am so proud to present our very first ever Arab American Heritage Month Forum with our two special guests. As a young boy, I was raised in the shadow of 9/11 and countless wars and destabilization in the Middle East. Both my parents lost their homes as young children in the Middle East due to terrorism, and always took that story with them and instilled that same sense of civic duty in me to always go back and help other families who have been victims of terrorism themselves. So this event is obviously extremely important, not just for me, but for all other sort of Arab American young individuals who are either at Harvard or around the country, who look towards civic engagement and public service as a future career and pathway and something they dream of being a part of. I'll pass it off now to Lena.
Hi, everybody. Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Lena Lofgren, and I'm honored to be the Director of Diversity and Outreach at the IOP this year, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to our incredible forum today. I personally became involved in politics through campaigns in my home state of Pennsylvania in the aftermath of the 2016 election, in large part because of the fear and apprehension and disillusionment that I could feel within my family and within my broader Arab and Muslim communities. And while I'm blessed to have been raised by some extremely strong Arab women. As someone who was interested in politics and public service, it was quite rare to see role models in the mainstream arena who had similar backgrounds or experiences or identities to myself. And the Institute of Politics has been a hugely fundamental community in my life in providing me with the opportunity to interact with people who have experiences and passions that are similar to mine, which is why I'm especially thrilled that today we have the opportunity to connect with incredibly established and incredible role models who do represent the intersectionality of the Arab American community and leadership in the United States. So I'll pass it back to Anand to share a bit more about our guests this evening.
Absolutely. So to our special guests, our honored guests this evening who have made time in their very, very busy schedule to come and chat with us all. I want to begin with Representative Iman Jodeh, who is starting what is sure to become an incredible career in public service. In just a few months in office, but over her whole life, she's done great work in Colorado. I think just 3 or 4 days ago, she passed a bill out of her chamber and another one out of committee. Thank you for those Instagram updates, Representative. Your leadership coincides with the Twitter era civil rights movement that we find ourselves in, the struggle for people of color, ongoing threats to our democracy, and a time of special need for both Arab Americans and Muslim Americans alike in our country. Your leadership in the Colorado State Legislature is representative and emblematic of what needs to be done elsewhere. And so I'm so honored to have you joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
We are also thrilled to welcome Secretary Donna Shalala here, who has had a truly illustrious and impactful career both in education and in public service. And I think it would be an understatement to call her a trailblazer in every field that she ever stepped foot in, from being the first Lebanese American to serve in a cabinet position, as Jenna mentioned, and the longest serving Secretary of Health and Human Services ever. And within education, not only was she the leader of 3 different universities, but she actually became the first woman ever to head a Big Ten school as president of the University of Wisconsin, and as U.S. representative for Florida's 27th congressional district. From 2019 to 2021, she used her own immigrant heritage to advocate on behalf of her district's immigrant communities on a vast array of issues. So Secretary Shalala has truly shown unparalleled leadership and dedication as a public servant and in the field of education. So we're thrilled to welcome you today because you're truly an inspiration to all of us here at the IOP. So I think we'll begin our conversation today by touching a bit on your personal journeys. So our first question is, how did your Arab identity influence your upbringing? And you're welcome to start as you please.
Please. Well, I grew up in the Arab American community of Cleveland, Ohio, in which my father was a leader in the community. I'm a second generation Arab American. My grandparents came to this country more than 100 years ago. In fact, my grandmother, all 4 of my grandparents are Lebanese, and they left during the Ottoman Empire, really because of discrimination, and came to this country. But my grandmother on my father's side was actually turned away at Ellis Island. And her mother, the story goes that her mother had gold bracelets up her arm, took her all the way around, and they snuck across the Mexican border. We actually didn't know that my grandmother was not a citizen until my mother was driving her to Social Security, and she burst into tears and told this story of sneaking across the Mexican border. So it is not just Latin Americans that have come across that way, but some Lebanese were forced to come across that way when they were turned away at Ellis Island more than 100 years ago. My father was a leader in the Lebanese and Syrian community in Cleveland. My family is Christian, Maronite on my father's side, Melkite on my mother's side, but it was a huge community, and I literally grew up in a very large, extended Lebanese family with lots of aunts and uncles and cousins, in a world in which everybody in my neighborhood had an immigrant background, but it was that leadership by my father in particular, who believed in women's education. Even now, I run into women who said they would have never gone to college if my father hadn't told their fathers that they had to educate the women in their family. My father believed deeply. He had an 8th grade education, but he not only supported my mother, who had an undergraduate degree, but also a law degree. So I grew up in this family that was committed to education, but more importantly, committed to the Arab community in our community.
You know,
I don't
when I
think
think
I ever had American food until I went to college.
Neither did I. So we're in the same boat there.
that may be a good problem to have.
But I, of course, have spent years in the Middle East, first as a Peace Corps volunteer and then in and out. I taught in a Palestinian refugee camp in Saida, the UNRWA camp there. I taught teachers of English during the time I was a graduate student. I went in and out of Syria and Lebanon. I lived in southern Iran as a Peace Corps volunteer in the Khuzestan, in the Arab area of Iran. So I've been in and out of the Middle East most of my career.
Wow, incredible. And I want to give Representative Jodeh an opportunity to talk about how your Arab identity influenced your upbringing as well.
Yeah, you know, when I think about my Arab identity and how it's influenced my upbringing and the lens that I bring to advocacy and legislation, I definitely, you know, recognize that as a first-generation American, being the daughter of Palestinian immigrants and refugees, a practicing Muslim, a woman of color, when you hold these identity markers, you also realize that not by choice, you inherit a lot of things that, you know, can institute generational trauma. And so I think for many Palestinians watching and for many Middle Easterners watching that have grown up in the United States, it was not uncommon for me as a child to be at, you know, Free Gaza, Free Palestine rallies as a child, or, you know, talking to lawmakers about the realities of the geopolitical situation of the Middle East. And so again, when you hold these identity markers, you inherit a conflict, especially for Palestinians, that speaks to oppression, apartheid, occupation. And so when we see these things happening, yes, a world away for Palestinians, only to see it happening in our backyards for Black Lives Matter, for women's rights, for our immigrant and refugee communities. Again, it gives me a different lens when I advocate or when I legislate. And I am very grateful for my Arab heritage and having those lived experiences that I can bring to the Capitol, because I feel like it really shaped those formative years of, you know, dictating what values I bring to the table. I will also say, just like Secretary Shalala, she, you know, she referenced her parents. My parents, you know, I give 110% of the credit to for the sacrifices that they made to realize their own American dream, while very much making it clear to all 4 of their children that there is no ceiling and you will never have a ceiling, and you are expected to break those glass ceilings if there are. And you know, I'm very proud that just like the secretary's father, my father was also a community leader here, a small business owner. He founded the largest and oldest mosque in the Rocky Mountain region, where I now serve as the spokeswoman, and is also in my House district. And he really did pave the way for a lot of those relationships as being a liaison for the Muslim and Arab community and the non-Muslim and Arab community, and really centering his advocacy around education, which then, you know, for all intents and purposes, created a platform for me to pick up that mantle as a Western-born, Western-educated woman, to say, I am incredibly fluent in my own Arab American heritage. I'm fluent in my religion, in my language, but I also have a key understanding of the American nuances that I need to navigate so I can further that mission of being a successful liaison between what's arguably the most misunderstood region of the world and the people that call it home.
Wow. Such incredible backstories that led you guys to pursue the careers that you want. But specifically, I know a lot of members in the Arab community, at least the Arab community I come from in Southern California, who ever since 9/11, but going on through the presidency of Donald Trump, have chosen to avoid politics, to avoid the public eye, to avoid public service, just because of the sort of the hate crimes and the associations and stereotypes that get put along with Arabs and Arab Americans. What led you to sort of pursue that route, that career, public service and politics?
Well, for me, it was almost accidental. I did spend a semester in Washington as an undergraduate and fell in love with Washington and politics. It never occurred to me that I would get back. I wanted originally to be a journalist. But the fact that I joined the Peace Corps, and it defined my life because of all the jobs I've ever had, I love that one. It makes you a citizen of the world. You live in a mud Arab village in southern Iran, and it gives you a different perspective on the world. So I just had incredible opportunities to come into public service. I got a PhD. I was an expert in politics and had an opportunity to join first as a very young, newly minted PhD, the Carter administration, and met the Clintons early on in my career. And Mrs. Clinton and I sat on the board of the Children's Defense Fund together. Meanwhile, I pursued an academic career and then had the opportunity first to serve at HUD in the Carter administration and then at HHS in the Clinton administration. I've just had an academic career in which I've been in and out of the academy and national service. And those were incredible opportunities that came out of networking and hard work and the security that my Arab American family gave me as I was growing up. There's something about growing up in an extended family that you think that you can do anything. Because everybody's so supportive, and you don't grow up. I did not grow up with deep insecurities because of this envelope that I grew up in with uncles and aunts, and everybody lived within a 2-block area, and grandparents, all of whom expected us to succeed and expected us to take advantage of opportunities. My father's family lost 2 sons in 2 of our wars, and my grandmother kept those gold stars in her windows until the day she died in the 1970s to remind everybody of the sacrifice our family had had. But she also cried for the Armenian friends that she had had during the Ottoman Empire that were caught in a genocide. Lots of Arab Americans were caught, Arabs were caught at the same time, particularly Maronites. But she had deep feelings about the Middle East and about her friends in Lebanon that she had grown up with and what the Ottoman Empire had done to them.
I think, my journey to politics was also very accidental. And I never planned on doing this. I am a trained political scientist. I have my undergraduate in political science and my master's in public policy. But it was never intended to culminate in a campaign or an elected office. It was really to influence policy. And my exposure to politics, like I said, while happened very young, I kind of charted my own course through local organizations like the Interfaith Alliance or my own organization, Meet the Middle East. I'm also a founding member of the Colorado Muslim Leadership Council, which also carved out a government and policy subgroup so that we can keep our finger on the pulse of policies that were happening in Colorado that directly affected our communities, which ultimately led to 6 years at the Capitol of testifying on legislation where no one else that looked like me or had my lens of advocacy or my lived experiences were testifying on these bills. And so honestly, my approach was, this piece of legislation is happening. I should probably go say something about that. And that was the lens that I brought. And, that lens translated in various ways, whether it was, should we re-up our civil rights division in Colorado? Should women get paid the same as men in Colorado? It was a myriad of topics, but it was very empowering to bring a Muslim and Arab woman perspective to these topics. And the way I realized this was happening wasn't until after my election that, upon reflection, I started to realize that I did use my identity as a practicing Muslim Arab woman of color to get myself into rooms where decisions were being made, but with the caveat that I was not there to be a box that was checked or to be a warm body that, they said, yeah, we have the BIPOC person, we have the Muslim person. I was in fact in these spaces to influence policy and to dictate policy. And the more that I felt empowered to do that, the more I realized that in these spaces, I was inadvertently dismantling systemic racism and stereotypes around what it was to be an Arab American and a Muslim woman. And a great example of this was, when I was testifying on equal pay for equal work in Colorado, which was the bill that said, yes, women should get paid the same as men. And my testimony and my lens was, 1400 years ago, God delivered a chapter in the Quran, Al-Nisa, the woman, but there's not a chapter called the man. And throughout the entire Quran, God gave women rights not granted to women in the West until the 1920s. So I'm educating the committee about these things. And yes, in the Muslim and Arab world, there have been 9 democratically elected women heads of state. Now I actually think we're at 14. Educating the committee. And, so by putting myself in these spaces, I'm using that forum and that platform of education to say, we actually have more in common based on our shared values that I bring to the table because of my lived experiences and because of this lens that I carry, that I hope allows us to find agreement around policy rather than disagreement.
Thank you both for those really impactful stories about how you happened upon public service, because you both certainly made your marks in your respective spheres, particularly as trailblazers and in that capacity as women and as minorities, and as the first individuals of Arab heritage to reach either of your respective positions in American politics, which is incredible. So we're curious to hear about some of the challenges that you faced in getting to that position and whether you feel that there was a way to avoid those challenges, and also maybe for Secretary Shalala, if you're interested in sharing whether you've seen those obstacles change since you entered public service.
Well, I'm part of the second wave of the women's movement in the United States. So my career was enhanced by women leaders who opened up opportunities. And so it was, I had a chance to be the first woman in a number of settings, whether it was to lead a major research university in this country or to sit on corporate boards. And it was really the women's movement that opened that up. But I also lived in an era in which, because I was an Arab American, I did not see the obstacles that my parents had seen or my grandparents would have seen if they lived in the South, for example, where Arab Americans could not buy land in the early part of the 20th century because they were considered Black and treated accordingly. So I had the advantage of having walls broken down to provide opportunities and a kind of openness by the political system. And frankly, an openness by the Jewish community to provide that never, the fact that I was an Arab American never worked against me in places like New York City, where I was welcomed by the immigrant communities in particular, but also by the leaders of the Jewish community who were supportive of both my career and of opportunities. So it wasn't that I didn't come with deep concern about the Palestinians or what was happening in the Middle East, but I just, my career began in a time in which there was more openness and more opportunities for Arab Americans. Bill Clinton used to say, shoot, if you want to get something done, you hire a Lebanese woman. That was his joke. But what he really meant was that providing opportunities to people who were willing to work hard, no matter what their ethnic background, was something that the new America was opening up. My mother faced incredible obstacles practicing law as a tennis player, a nationally ranked tennis player, because she was an Arab American, but that did not happen to my career. In fact, just the opposite. In fact, even in Congress today, as I talk to Republican colleagues, everybody has a friend who's an Arab American. Everybody knows someone in a community. And I found bipartisan openness. I remember having a conversation with the Secretary of State in the Trump administration who talked to me about the large Arab American community that he had come out of. And of course, there were two Arab Americans in the Trump administration in the cabinet, one at Defense and one at HHS. So we have made breakthroughs in the community, but it also allowed us to support the community when there were opportunities. I started to talk about the Armenians because we had never had a breakthrough in terms of passing a resolution about the genocide because of the role of the Turkish government and of the American government not wanting to mess with the Turkish government. We did it in 2019, led by Anna Eshoo of California, in large part because the world had changed and we had an opportunity, we had enough members of Congress. We got a huge vote for it over the objection of some very strong partisans that put pressure on us not to do it. And we had an opportunity to pass bills that supported the Palestinians and the Arab American community at the same time, and the Muslims in the Congress and I worked together on whatever issues we could work on that would help the community.
And Representative Jodeh, I'm curious to hear about the challenges you faced, particularly because you first entered college and began, entering the public service field right after 9/11, and I think during both the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan is when you were sort of rising in prominence in American politics, or in Colorado politics, excuse me. How did that influence you, and was that a challenge?
Yeah, Anand, when you were talking about your own childhood, I was reflecting on my own. I grew up in the wake of two Gulf Wars, and yes, went to college during 9/11 and Iraq and Afghanistan. And they did have a huge impact on the realities that the Arab and Muslim communities faced here in Colorado. And I think it's also worth noting, when you grow up in cities like, Dearborn or in New York, where there are higher concentrations of Arabs that do have resources, have established professionals, have money and lobbying power to get things done, that presents a different reality. But out here in the wild, wild West, that is not the case. And that was not a luxury that was afforded to myself or many Arab Americans here. And we did and continue to have an uphill battle when it comes to having a seat at the table. In my own campaign, my primary opponent used my faith and my heritage against me. And, deciding not to engage and not to respond to that kind of rhetoric was, I think, the right thing to do. It also gets to the point where when you are able to sit in your power and to sit in, and whether that's your elected seat or your expertise or whatever it is that you bring to the table, you also start to realize that you don't have to, for lack of a better term, stoop to that level, because the work that you do, right, just like Madam Secretary, her track record speaks to dismantling that racism and those preconceived notions around being Arab, around being an Arab woman. And those are the kind of the same things that I'm learning and navigating right now as a younger politician. But unfortunately, another thing that I'm starting to realize and have been fighting for a very long time is actually that mistrust and generational trauma within our own community. And I remember during the election and during campaign season, while I had a lot of support from the Arab and Muslim community here, I was getting equally amount of messages and calls. Why should I vote? Why should I vote for, an election or candidates that have hurt the Muslim or Arab world? And so, again, navigating these spaces, using education as a tool to dismantle all of these myths around civic engagement and our obligation to, in fact, be a part of community on all levels. And for me, a big part of that was, okay, if you want to take that piece of mentality and apply that, then please don't complain when something doesn't go your way regarding foreign policy, regarding your healthcare, regarding, homelessness, whatever it is your issue is, don't complain because you didn't vote. And if you cannot see the value in guiding any administration or elected official towards the values that you believe in because of your vote, then that's a larger conversation that we need to be having. And again, it's also not lost upon me that there's a high concentration in Colorado of immigrants and refugees who did not have the luxury of voting in their home countries. Mm-hmm. And voting for them oftentimes was a death sentence or was something that was predetermined and not worth even going to the polls for. So again, creating spaces, navigating these spaces, and creating a platform for community to feel empowered that their voice does matter, and that hopefully by electing the first Muslim and the first Arab woman, they can see themselves in their representation and use me as a liaison to be their voice in a space that they have been traditionally underrepresented.
9/11 was an incredible challenge. I was a college president. I had literally just arrived at the University of Miami to take over the presidency. And I knew that our Arab students and our Arab American students would be very challenged at 9/11. So I called together the student leaders with the leaders of the Arab American organizations, as well as some of our Arab students. And the student leaders were incredible. They said any attack against you is an attack on us. And so the leaders, the students themselves came together to embrace their fellow students and in many ways to send a message across the student body. I remembered that we actually had a Muslim, an Iranian on the football team. And I asked him to explain to the athletes what it meant to be a Muslim and what the religion was about. And it wasn't about crashing into the World Trade Center. And he played an important role in education. We did not have one incident created by a student or a faculty member or a staff member. We had some guy that came off campus that said something to one of our Sikh students, because of course they had the headpiece. But that person we banned. We literally got a court order to make sure they could never enter the campus ever again. But we actually worked at it using our student leaders, not me, but our student leaders and students across the campus to make sure that they understood that we were one community and that we supported each other. And the religion itself didn't have anything to do with the destruction of that occurred during 9/11. And so the Arab students from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and I talked to their ambassadors myself, they stayed on campus. They did not go home.
And unfortunately in Colorado, we had the opposite. While community very much showed up for the Muslim community, our international students from the Middle East all there was a mass exodus, and that also impacted universities quite a bit because of international tuition. And I remember my father and mother being instrumental working with the University of Colorado and President Hoffman at the time to make sure that those students felt safe to come back. So Secretary, thank you for that work, because it's making our students feel safe is incredibly important.
You know, we talked to parents ourselves, not just to the ambassadors, but reassured parents that the students were safe on campus. And they were safe because the community put their arms around them and made it very clear that anything else was unacceptable. Now, it's a smaller campus, but I think it was important to empower the students to provide leadership during 9/11.
You know, I think those leadership lessons are so important, just not just to celebrate, but to engage and understand and communicate today. I mean, today, I think we find ourselves at a time where those lessons of leadership in the Arab American community are all the more urgent, all the more relevant, and all the more important, not just for us or for me, you know, as a college student, but for all the younger children who look to Arab representatives in Congress, former Representative Keith Ellison, who's now Attorney General, or Representative Rashida Tlaib from Michigan, or Representative Ilhan Omar from Somalia, to inspire them and sort of engage them within the public service sphere. I want to ask you, and we can start off with Representative Jodeh. How did your Arab identity inform your decision making? How would you look at issues differently than your colleagues?
You know, I think it informs it in that lens that I bring, right? Is as a Palestinian American, like I said, you inherit that generational trauma. While being the first is incredibly exciting and very, it's very flattering, it's very honoring. It can also sometimes be very lonely. I don't 100% fit into a caucus based on my religion or ethnicity. There is no Muslim caucus, there's no Arab caucus, right? But the Colorado Democratic Black Caucus adopted me as an adoptive member with full voting rights. And I think it was in that spirit that they definitely recognized there is a shared lived experience when it comes to occupation, apartheid, and oppression that our Black brothers and sisters here in America are also experiencing. And you know, it's unfortunate that we have to draw upon these shared lived experiences. And you know, a part of that is when I go to Palestine, I can't vote. I have to ride on a separate bus. I enter the holy spaces through a different entrance. I'm detained upon entrance. I have, you know, I live behind a wall, and you know, go so on and so forth. Yes, my, you know, Palestinians are caged and are held without due process. And again, there is a stark reality and parallel that I live with a world away that is happening right here in my own backyard. And it is not lost upon me that when I hear Miss Shanine McLean talk about the murder of Elijah here in Aurora, again, those stark parallels that I'm drawing upon as a Palestinian, as a Muslim, is not lost upon me. And that's what I take to committee. That's what I take to the House floor. That's what I remember. That's what I think about when I advocate for bills or against bills that are not a reflection of what not only Aurora needs, but what the brown, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and immigrant and refugee communities need. And that's the voice that I'm hoping to advocate for and bring that lived experience to. It's incredibly sad that those are the experiences that I have to draw upon, right? It's incredibly sad that in 2021, we are still questioning the validity of BIPOC communities in our country and in our states, and that there are members of our society that are still fighting for equal rights, right? Or basic civil rights that unfortunately, when our Constitution was drafted, we the people, and that all men were created equal, did not apply to them, you know. And so it gives me great pause that in this day and age we are still fighting this uphill battle. But I also take solace in the fact knowing that we are not quiet about it. Again, we sit in power, we know our voice, and we know that through strategic surgical precision in our advocacy and our legislation, we will make change, and not just incremental change, but sometimes sweeping legislation that will dictate the future of what we envision for future generations.
Secretary Shalala, did you want to take a crack at the question?
No, I think that Iman speaks for all of us. My deep commitment is to these immigrant communities and to opportunities, and to make sure that where your parents, your grandparents came from, or where you came from, does not affect your opportunities in this country. So I think my heritage gave me that kind of passion, but not just for the immigrant communities, but for the African-American community as well, and the indigenous communities. And that's the way I identify.
That's beautiful. And I see that we've just hit the time for questions from the audience. So if everyone could, if you do have a question, please raise your hand as an attendee in the function at the bottom of your screen, and hopefully we'll have time to get to you. But I know Lena is holding our first question right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much again for all of your amazing remarks. I think I especially resonate with the ways in which Arab identity, although it may in some ways pose obstacles to access to opportunities and platforms and the ability to have your voice heard, can also give you the ability to empathize more deeply with both the Arab community and also plenty of other BIPOC communities in the United States and abroad. So now we'll open it up to some of our amazing student attendees with some questions, beginning with a junior at the college and our president at the Institute of Politics, Minat Banasi. Sorry, Manat, I think you're muted.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Lena. Thanks, Anand. Thank you so much, all of you, for the wonderful conversation. Yes, my name is Manat, and like Lena said, I serve as president of the IOP, also Egyptian American, so the celebration of Arab American Heritage Month has meant a significant amount to all of us. I'd love to hear from both of you about two things. What inspires you to do the good work that you do? And secondly, what advice do you have for other young Arab Americans who are looking to make an impact?
Well, I'm inspired by by my grandparents, by their challenges when they came to this country with nothing, and were able to create families that had opportunities, and they believed so deeply in this country. But they also believed in keeping their heritage, their language, their culture, and thought that could be part of the American experience and the American dream. And they instilled in me a passion, I think, which resulted in public service, but in also understanding their struggle. And keeping ties to our communities in the Middle East was important to them. And so it's my grandparents more than anything else. And I had the luxury of growing up with all four of my grandparents within a 2-block radius, with aunts and uncles, and with a huge supportive Lebanese Syrian community. But that's what, in the end, they instilled in me a deep understanding of their experience and what they expected of their grandchildren in terms of making opportunity available for everyone. They didn't think America was perfect, but they thought their grandchildren could make it closer to being perfect.
I will echo the Secretary's remarks. My parents were definitely my biggest inspiration. My mother was a teacher and did a lot of translating for Denver Public Schools with immigrants and refugees and Arabic speakers. My father, small business owner, and again, both of them very much instilled in all of their children, there is no ceiling, and if there is, you shall break it. And really giving them the pathways to opportunities that they were never afforded living in Palestine. And again, I think it is, when I talk about the American dream, it's not a trite or cliche phrase for myself. This is something that truly established my family. And I am the product of that American dream, but it's not lost upon me that that's still hard to grasp for a lot of people and to realize for a lot of people. And so, you know, I'm inspired by also Arab and Muslim women who, you know, raise their children and proudly wear the hijab every day in spaces where they may not be welcome, and shrug it off. I'm incredibly inspired by those women. I'm inspired by, sorry.
It's okay.
I think about my husband, who grew up in Baghdad, and you know, his American dream was just like my parents. And he came here and he put himself through nursing school and became a nurse. And then he passed legislation on the state level that was groundbreaking in the United States that granted in-state tuition for immigrants and refugees, something that was also never afforded to him. And now from Baghdad, Iraq, he is the district director and deputy chief of staff for Congressman Jason Crow. And so that is, to me, the definition of the American dream, right? Is coming from war and oppression to working for Congress. And I think of my older brother, who is a lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force at the Air Force Academy, who again sits in his power as one of the most educated people I know, to navigate these spaces in a place that has traditionally been against our identity, right? And has been able to dismantle a lot of those stereotypes by just simply being in these spaces, creating relationships, and educating people.
Thank you so much. Your words are so powerful to me, and I'm sure that a lot of members of our audience can also relate to the emotional experience of having that identity of being an immigrant, or having parents or grandparents who are immigrants, and seeing them realize their dreams. I know I'm exactly the same way with my mother. So thank you for expressing your emotion.
Thank you.
I know you had some of us tearing up there, and I know you probably have a few of our attendees tearing up as well. So thank you so much for being so vulnerable and sharing with us, Representative Jodeh. I want to turn to our second student questioner who's joining us tonight, freshman from the Harvard College, Ryan Tierney.
All right, thank you very much. And it's really an honor to have you all speak to us this evening, Representative Jodeh. I'm actually from Douglas County, Colorado, so it's very nice to see another Colorado face out here. I know I've been a little homesick lately as the semester's worn on, so it's good to see a familiar face. My question is for you specifically. In recent years, I mean, we've been talking about this issue of kind of breaking the glass ceiling for Arab Americans and all sorts of different aspects of American life, like politics and employment and everything. And a lot of times, at least from a political view, you think about it from like a voter perspective, like, can you get elected? But in recent weeks and years, it's almost it's also been kind of brought to the country stage that a lot of times that the people that you have to work with in the legislation may not really respect you for who you are. I mean, from Colorado, we have Representative Lauren Boebert, who has not made a very good name for our state in the past several months. And then on the state level, for state representatives, I know that I had some major grievances against one of my representatives who voiced some very vulgar things about Muslims in Colorado. So how do you, as a Muslim, as a woman, how do you kind of meet that, give forgiveness and move on and make progress with it, and be able to meet these people where they are and say, okay, you may not like me for who I am, but we're going to go ahead and work on this. How do you do that? Because it seems really hard.
I really appreciate that question, Ryan. And Colorado misses you, and I'm sure the trails of the mountains are calling your name soon. You know, I think it's something that, again, I've been subconsciously navigating my whole life, right? It's how do you put yourself in these spaces to make positive, impactful change while knowing that there are people in these spaces that are completely and utterly against your identity, no matter your faith or your heritage or both, or sometimes your gender, right? And so I think this is where, about a month and a half ago, I was asked to give the opening prayer in the House of Representatives. And growing up, I would go with my father, who would give the opening prayer in both chambers, in the Senate and the House in Colorado. And I would sit off to the side, and I would watch him do this every year. And last month, I did it for the first time as a sitting rep. And I thought about this exact point, right? Is how do I reach across the aisle and really prove to people we actually have more in common than not? And so I really crafted that prayer around our shared beliefs, knowing that oftentimes it is faith that drives people across the aisle to dictate their policies, which is fine. You know, that is absolutely their right and their choice. But I also wanted to create that bridge for them to understand that, you know what, I also believe X, Y, and Z, and here's how we do it as Muslims. I'm giving the opening prayer again tomorrow during the first day of Ramadan. And I want to talk about these similarities around fasting, right? Fasting is not exclusive to Islam by any means, right? And so how can we come together around this? On Easter, I made it a point to post pictures of my time in Jerusalem and talk about the Jodeh family who has the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And since the time of Salah ad-Din has opened and closed that church for their Christian brothers and sisters and been the custodians of this church, right? So it is relationships. And the biggest commodity we deal in is in fact relationship building. And if I can utilize that to the best of my ability to say, you know what, I understand your views on immigration. Here's a piece of legislation that speaks to those views, but furthers my agenda on progressive immigration legislation and reform. And so I successfully did that this past session. I passed a U visa bill, and it was bipartisan. And so again, how do we come to the table around these shared values? And I know that can kind of sound a little fluffy, but it is really built around those shared values and building relationships where I can say, you know what, Representative, this past weekend, you and I were talking about fly fishing in Colorado, which we both really enjoy. Let's talk about how we can protect those spaces together.
Thank you so much, Representative. I think that call for unity and collaboration is something that we can all use a little bit more of right now. And thank you for the question, Ryan. We'll move to our next questioner, who is Nina.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I want to first say that I'm a second generation Lebanese American on my dad's side and second generation Syrian American on my mother's side. And Secretary Shalala's story, although I grew up in northern New Hampshire above a grocery store that my grandmother and aunt and dad ran, it was just wonderful to hear. But I wanted to ask a question that addresses both Representative Jodeh's perspectives and yours. In that I ended up with a career in the United Nations in peacekeeping and gender justice for 33.5 years. And it all started when I volunteered with a small group of Palestinian women teachers on the West Bank in Gaza who brought me in their little Volkswagen during a self-created internship throughout the refugee camps to visit the families of political prisoners. And it literally changed my life. I immediately transferred from Smith in education to Harvard in Middle East Studies, and then became a lawyer with a second degree in Islamic law. And when I'm mentioning that because Secretary Shalala recalls the impact of her Peace Corps exposure and living amongst an entirely different life and a meager life, but a very rich life, that can't be weighed in terms of economic prosperity. And the representative talked about the oppression and the impact, the outright unfairness, the violation, and how yet it both drove both of you, and I think myself, to pursue public service. And I think what I wanted to ask you is, I think that exposure and living that, whether you personally live the injustice or you witness it firsthand at a very early age, does that encourage you to do public service? And secondly, I am convinced, also after working in the UN and in 6 peacekeeping missions in the field, that perhaps the legislature and Senate would be more open about the Palestinian and Middle East issue if they actually had exposure. I'm convinced that if you brought delegations and you wouldn't have to narrate anything, if they just witness the reality on the ground, it really changes and it makes one rethink. It would be hard not to believe that everyone would rethink. So I wanted to ask you whether you think that exposure, very young, was an impetus for public service and created an empathy for all the oppressed persons and communities that you ended up supporting. And secondly, whether the sort of stalemate we're at in terms of of understanding the Palestinian issue maybe could be overcome by increasing exposure of those delegates to the actual situation on the ground. Thank you. I was long-winded, but I'm sorry.
No, thank you for your service. Yes, there's no question that my exposure early in my career, I was 20 years old when I went into the Peace Corps, made a difference, shaped my life, particularly the time I spent in the Palestinian refugee camps, the UNRWA camp in Saida. Gave me a different perspective. It wasn't that my family wasn't sympathetic to, and Palestinians were starting in the second generation to come to the United States and to Cleveland in particular, but those experiences certainly shaped my life. The Congress makes a real effort of taking the newly elected members to both Palestine as well as to Israel as part of, and we, unfortunately, they take the Democrats go in their own group and the Republicans go in their own group, but we did interact at the end. And I think that being exposed both to the Palestinian community and to Palestinian leaders, as well as to Israeli leaders, made a difference in terms of opening people's eyes. Many of the members of Congress had never been to the Middle East. I mean, I actually had spent years in the Middle East, so it was not new for me, though I came back thinking, I can't wait for the new generation of leaders in both Palestine and in Israel to take their places, because these old guys are so locked into their own experiences. And the new generation that we met was much more hopeful, was reaching across, really, I thought would come with different attitudes, more like the representative in terms of trying to work together and to work through some of these issues. So, but the Congress does take everyone. So everyone at some point, and quite open in meeting both Palestinian leaders, village people, and young Palestinians who were very impressive, young entrepreneurs that we had an opportunity to spend time with.
I really appreciate that question, Nina, for a few reasons. One, you're right. It does shape your experience when you are shot at, tear gassed, when your uncle is murdered, in the Intifada, when you look down the barrel of a tank, when you are beaten with a machine gun. This shapes you, and yes, it does traumatize you. And these are all things that have happened to me personally. And when I came into the House, I had members tell me, oh yeah, we went to Israel and the Israeli lobby paid for it, and they paid for our spouses, and it was amazing. And you're also talking to someone who, as the founder and executive director of a locally based nonprofit called Meet the Middle East, who literally did that for 12 years, take Americans to the Middle East.
Oh.
It was very hard to hear, because my trips are not fluffy, foofy trips. We walk in refugee camps. We hear from refugees. We do very hard things that are not, let's sit around a table and talk with, elected politicians. I make them experience the true reality that is not shown here in the United States on both sides, and so when I show them a wall, on one side, it's pretty and it's painted and there's murals, and on the other side, it's completely different. And let's have a conversation about the realities around this. And so hearing from my colleagues about their trip to Palestine, and what they experienced made me realize that it was incredibly one-sided, and that they did not walk in the path of Palestinians and have not been exposed to the realities on the ground, which they are directly funding as Americans. And so this is something that I hope to change. And that, as I build my own footing in the State House, I will use those resources and 12 years of experiences of taking Americans to the Middle East to put people in their path that can help shape their own decision, not shape their, opinion, but help them understand the realities of what's going on. And that's what I've been successful at doing for 12 years, was just creating an unobstructed 300-degree platform for them to make their own educated decision about the realities that they lived over this 2-week period that they haven't seen on TV, nor was dictated by wealth or power.
I think that's extremely important. The congressional trip that I went on was quite balanced in terms of the time we spent and who we talked to. And I, of course, have an added experience having spent a lot of time in refugee camps, in Palestinian refugee camps, particularly in Lebanon itself, in Saida.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to all the questions from the audience, and I'm so sorry that we didn't have time to get to all of them. We've reached the top of the hour and the end of our discussion, but I want to say thank you again to Secretary Shalala and Representative Jodeh for joining us. Thank you for being so generous and gracious with your time and allowing us to be a little bit selfish with you and steal you away from your incredible work. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. That concludes our conversation on generations of Arab American service. I hope we were able to inspire the next generation of young Arab American students to pursue careers in public service, whether it be politics, education, whatever field it is, but just serving people, which has become so important and such a rich part of our identity. Please come back and join us tomorrow for the 2021 Goldsmith Awards here at the Forum, 6 p.m., where we announce winners for amazing journalists across the country in investigative reporting. And join us on Friday for a conversation with the, ambassadors of Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, 1 p.m. Friday, Eastern time. And with that, thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Ramadan Kareem to everyone who's celebrating tomorrow.
Thank you. And it's wonderful anytime to meet with young people who have such a bright future. And thank to my longtime friend, Mark Guerin.
Thank you, everyone. Jazakallah khair, Ramadan Kareem. Shukran.